In 1895, China lost the war to Japan, another in 57 long years of humiliations. Numerous cities, the entire Yangtze River, had been forced open to foreign trade. The USA had a permanent fleet stationed in the Yangtze to guard its own civilians. With this latest loss, China could only watch as the Republic of Formosa briefly declared independence before Japan conquered it, and several European countries took advantage of a now weakened China to force yet more concessions, with entire cities handed over to the European powers. When the Boxer Rebellion came about, and the China found itself at war with everybody, numerous provinces declared neutrality. China could no longer force its own people to fight for it. In 1903, when Britain wanted to negotiate with Tibet, they just casually sent an army in to meet the Dalai Lama. This is the story of China's century of humiliation. The story of how China fractured into 1,000 pieces, and the story of the piece that happened to win out over all the other pieces. You see, after a successful overthrow of the government in 1912, and a failed one in 1913 by the Kuomintang, there would be a third revolution in 1916. This revolution would force the president to resign, and China devolved into utter chaos. With central authority eliminated, there was 700 revolutions in China. By the end of the First World War, Japan was occupying the Chinese Eastern Railway, and China had fractured into several cliques, and the most powerful clique was called the Anhui, which controlled Tuva and Mongolia, and they jointly control the Beijing puppet government with the Zhili clique. But then one day in 1920, the Zhili clique tells the puppet president to sack the Anhui general that's occupied Mongolia and Tuva. The Anhui say, no, and boom, war's begun. The Fengtian clique sides with the Zhili, the Japanese side with the Anhui, but it's all over in a matter of days. The Zhili clique defeats the Anhui in Mongolia and Tuva, which allows the White Army to come in and take over. Very briefly, because the Soviet Union comes in and takes them over. The Anhui has been defeated, and now the Zhili clique shares power in China with the Fengtian. But they don't like sharing power with the Fengtian, so they defeat them as well. Boom. Now the Zhili clique's in charge. So after being defeated in 1922, the Fengtian immediately began plotting their revenge. They said, oh god, if only there was somebody who could help me get revenge on the clique that just betrayed me. And as a matter of fact, there was. Do you remember the Kuomintang mentioned earlier, failed rebellion in 1913? Well, they had just overthrown the Guangdong clique, and now they agreed to help the Fengtian. So, in 1924, when the Zhili went to whatever was left of the Anhui and said surrender or die, can anybody help me here? You see, the Zhili just came to me and said something to the effect of surrender or die, and can anyone help me? This is great! No, go back to them, say something to the effect of, never, we shall never surrender from you, you waste of space, and then he's going to attack you. I am going to use that as an excuse to invade him from the north, and then we'll fight him, from this guy. He's going to attack from the south. And not only that, but one of the key generals fighting for the Zhili has agreed to mutiny and occupy Beijing from the Zhili. So the mutinying general, the KMT, me and you, and we, are going to attack him from four sides and essentially just rip the Zhili limb from limb. Fengtian, where the heck is the KMT? Yeah, I was wondering that. Buddy, why aren't you doing your southern attack? We need you. Oh yeah, about that. So a guy called Chen is doing a revolution in the south, trying against us, so we're busy focusing on him right now. We can't possibly attack him in the south, you know, just... A Zhili general whipped through his troops from the front and went back to occupy Beijing. He was staging a coup. The Zhili not only had less troops on the front, but they had to send yet more troops away to fight the couing general. The Fengtian had been plotting this revenge for 2 years. They'd made alliances with the KMT, the Anhui, and that mutinous general. With 3 friends, they knew that if one of them copped out, they would still have 2 other allies to attack with. And it had paid off. The Zhili were left decimated, divided, and dislodged from the northern provinces. Meanwhile, the mutinous general conquered a bunch of land and named his new land the Kuomintang. And then, the Zhili clique and the Anhui clique teamed up and defeated the Kuomintang. But the Zhili clique isn't going to last much longer. Next up... Sorry, just thinking about it again. But the Zhili clique isn't going to last much longer, because next up, the KMT has recovered from their rebellion. The KMT put together a coalition, and, with Soviet support, they pushed north and eliminated the Zhili clique. They considered killing a bunch of their communist allies because they didn't trust them for some reason, but the Soviet Union said, if you purge all the communists, we'll cut off their support. And at that time, they still needed Soviet support. But then, they pushed a bit further, and within a few months, they weaned themselves off of Soviet aid and purged the communists from their ranks. This would result in the beginning of the Chinese Civil War in 1927, when the Chinese Communist Party began a series of revolutions against the Kuomintang. Meanwhile, Wuhan had separated from the KMT and declared that they were actually the government of the Kuomintang. And at that exact moment, the Guangxi comes in from the south and occupies Guangdong. They've turned on their KMT allies. The KMT defeats both of them, and at that point, more and more warlords in China recognize them as the legitimate government because they can see which way the wind is blowing. The Feng Tian, meanwhile, tries to take the railway from Soviet ownership. But then, two warlords suddenly decide that they're not allies of Chiang Kai-shek anymore and take Beijing from them. The KMT wins, of course, and then Feng Tian declares itself an ally of the KMT and occupies Beijing for them. Then a revolution begins in XinJiang, and the Ma clique sends troops to help that revolution, and Guangdong rises against the Kuomintang. And then the Japanese come in and occupy Manchuria from Feng Tian, and Japan supports the rebels in Inner Manchuria, forcing the Chinese to concede large amounts of territory for them. The Chinese Communist Party finally gets encircled by the nationalists, but they break out and do a really long march to the north to escape. I mean, they even named it the Long March. The Soviet Union also intervenes and occupies XinJiang. And boy, the leader of XinJiang is not happy that his country is getting occupied by the Soviet Union. But there's nothing he can do about it, except spend multiple years plotting revenge against the Soviets. At this point, the situation in China is the north is controlled by the Soviet Union, the northeast is controlled by Japan, Tibet is independent, a large part of the western region is controlled by the Ma clique, everything else is either controlled by the nationalists or influenced by the nationalists. But you know the main reason that the KMT didn't bother to resist the Japanese conquest of Hebei? Because they were too busy trying to defeat the communists. But finally, the generals realised they have to focus on the Japanese. Alright, listen up, buddy Chiang. I know what your obsession is with fighting the communists, but there is currently a much greater threat to the Chinese nationalist movement than them. Japanese. God, I cannot believe when the Japanese threatened to occupy Hubei, you just gave it to them because you couldn't be bothered because you were too busy fighting the communists. If the communists were a threat, they would not have spent 9,000 miles running away from us. They literally named it the infamous Long March. Long March away from us because they're terrified. Just make an alliance with the communists, and they can help us fight the Japanese. We'll kick them out of China, and hopefully to the curb. And then we'll turn on the communists and beat them. Now, in which case you're under house arrest until you agree. Which is just as well, because the main Japanese invasion to take over all of China is finally coming. They land a naval force in Shanghai and launch an invasion down south from the north. Within a matter of months, Nanking, Wuhan, Beijing, Shanghai are all under Japanese control. Most of the Chinese population is occupied. At this point, the USA is still patrolling the Yangtze to protect Chinese citizens, but then Japan accidentally sunk a US ship, so, you know, the USA gets angry at Japan, but it doesn't lead to a war yet. There's a rebellion against the Soviets in Kazakhstan. The Soviets win. Finally, remember how I said that the leader of XinJiang was not happy that he was being occupied by the Soviet Union? Well, in 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union began. Germany was at the gates of Moscow. So the XinJiang government takes an opportunity to take a leaf out of Stalin's book and does a purge. Any communist in a position of power is demoted. Japan pushes so far into northern China that they establish a land connection with India. However, they're not going to last much longer. The Soviet Union comes in from the north and occupies Manchuria. Then, with the American bombings on Japan, Japan surrenders, and China gets all their land back. Well, most of it anyway. The Soviet Union still has to decide what are they going to do with Manchuria, and they decide to give it to the Communist Party. And with that, the Communists begin their takeover of China. Pretty soon, it's almost all under their control. Whatever's left of the Kuomintang flees to places like Laos and Burma, where China actually has to go in and finish them off. A remnant of the KMT holds out until 1958. The rest escape to Taiwan, where they hold out to this day. And that is the story of how China collapsed and reunified, you know?